This is the last conversation I thought we'd be having. I didn't sign up to have this conversation.
Hey guys, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we are back with our Bachelor Book Club because we are going to be reviewing Matt James's new memoir, First Impressions. I just finished it this morning. It took me about 2.5 days to read, which I am really proud of because I am not the best reader. I never have been in school, but I am so dedicated to reading these books for you guys because I'm reading them so you don't have to. And I have to say that Matt James's book was really, really good. I enjoyed reading it. I think the beginning really captivated me, talking about his family and his upbringing, and then the middle was a little boring because it was a lot about like sports. And then when we got to the end and it was the Bachelor part, I was totally reinvested and so interested. So I'm gonna be telling you guys all about the book, what you need to know, the hot tea, and everything else in between. But before we get into it, make sure you guys are subscribed to my channel. Subscribe down below, give this video a thumbs up, leave your comments, and we will get into the book review.
I think a lot of it has to do with me.
So Matt James' First Impressions, off-screen conversations with a bachelor on race, family, and forgiveness. Matt James had no idea what was in store when he agreed to be the first black lead on the 25th season of ABC's beloved television show, The Bachelor. You may think you know everything there is to know about him, but that was only his first impression. And it's honestly very true. Matt James had no idea when he was cast that he was going to be the first black lead. He really has never seen the show before. He was never a fan of the show. He never watched the show. When his best friend Tyler Cameron ended up going on The Bachelorette, that's how he was basically introduced to the Bachelor franchise, not only by fans, but by himself. And then once Tyler got on the show, of course he had to watch his buddy Tyler. I don't think he watched a lot of Hannah's season, but he definitely saw the Tyler parts. And then because him and Tyler were best friends and roommates at the time, that's when Bachelor Nation started to get introduced to him and when we started to know who he was. And that's kind of how he ended up on The Bachelor himself. Now, him and Tyler met in college. A lot of people were asking me if they're still friends, how did they meet? They met in college at Wake Forest University. They both played football. It's in North Carolina. And they became really close friends, and they both found themselves living in New York City a few years after college. So that's when they decided to move in together. Matt and Tyler would go out and stuff and see the producers, and the producers really liked Matt and they wanted to see him on the next season of The Bachelorette. However, Matt James was so against it. He didn't want to do it. He was finally getting his career. It took him a minute to kind of find like money and stability. He finally found that. The producers were like badgering him to join the next season of The Bachelorette. He was so hesitant about it, but it was actually Tyler's mom, Andrea, that convinced Matt to do it. She told him that opportunity comes, and she saw how much Tyler changed and how open he was with his feelings and the opportunities. She really thought it would be a good thing for Matt to do it, so he finally agreed to do it, and he got cast for Claire Crawley's season of The Bachelorette. However, he never ended up making it to Claire's season. If you guys don't remember, Claire's season was the height of the pandemic, so her season got postponed maybe like 6 months because of filming.
I feel like I just met my husband.
So let's kind of start at the beginning and I'll get into the Bachelor parts. I'm gonna go through the first few chapters. I won't take too much of your time up. I know you want to hear the Rachel tea. So Matt James grew up in Raleigh, North Carolina. He was very close with his mom. His mom and his brother, they were like really, really close. He was raised basically by a single mom because his mom and dad separated when he was 2. His dad was very unfaithful to his mom. He worked for the airline, so he was always in and out of town. And when he was in and out of town, he was just hooking up with other girls, had so many side pieces. And a lot of these stories would get back to Matt's mom, but she never wanted to believe them. His dad would lie to her. And eventually, like, there was just such hard evidence that Matt's mom took Matt and his brother John, and they moved into his grandparents' house. They left while his dad was out of town because she could not deal with the cheating anymore. So they lived in their grandparents' house for like 7 months before Matt's mom was able to kind of get a job and get back on her own 2 feet. And Matt's dad ended up moving to Durham, North Carolina, which was like an hour and a half away. He lived on like a trailer farm where they sold like old used cars and stuff. And he would have like side pieces come in and out all throughout Matt's childhood. And Matt would spend a lot of time, you know, going back and forth, but mostly he lived with his mom. And his mom was just like his rock and his everything. And he had so many kind things to say about his mom. but he didn't have that many kind things to say about his dad. Obviously, you know, they had a very strained relationship, which we saw on The Bachelor when Matt's dad came and they confronted their issues, but I didn't realize how in-depth it was because we didn't get to see that all play out on TV. And after reading the backstory, I had chills. I was so fascinated in the family dynamic and the hurdles that Matt had to overcome with his dad. I mean, it just seems so like heart-wrenching to know that your dad was just living another life. Dad ended up having 2 or 3 other kids with 3 different women. So it was just like a whole thing where Matt felt like his dad like didn't really want him or his brother John and didn't care about them as much when they were growing up. Like he just wasn't there. Like there was times when he said he was showing up and he never came. So by the time Matt was a teenager, he just kind of stopped going to his dad's house because he just didn't feel loved by his dad.
I hate to stop you, though. I didn't have that either. My father was killed when I was 5, Matt.
So when we saw that all play out on The Bachelor, that was like years of build-up between Matt and his dad that finally needed to be confronted. I don't think he necessarily like told us in the book where he stands with his dad today, but I do believe they have a better relationship. They definitely solved a lot of their problems on The Bachelor, so I think they're committed, and I'm hoping that they have a good relationship today because they didn't really have much of one for a long time. Now, Matt talks a lot about his childhood growing up as a half black and a half white boy. A lot of his cousins were full white, so his grandfather actually treated him and his brother John very differently because he was racist. He had definitely some prejudices and he was traditional, as he liked to say. He would get the white cousins nicer presents for Christmas and he would never tell Matt and his brother John, "I love you" back, which was really, really hard to read. So one day the grandfather ended up falling and Matt's mom could not get out of work to go help him and pick him up. So she called Matt and his brother John and tried to get them to go help their grandfather, and Matt and John were so hesitant because they felt so disrespected by their grandfather for so many years that they literally didn't even want to help him while he was like laying on the ground like very hurt. And eventually John like slammed on the brakes and turned around and they went to go help their grandfather, and that was the first time when Matt saw his grandfather in a very vulnerable stage because his grandfather had really thick and tough skin. So Matt asked him, once he helped his grandfather up, the grandfather was thankful, he was fine. Matt asked him, he was like, "Why don't you love us?" And the grandfather had to explain that he took out all of his resentment he had at Matt's father for disrespecting his mom and cheating on her for so many years on Matt and his brother John, as well as him being, you know, old school and all that other BS. And that was kind of the first time where they had an open and raw conversation about why Matt and his brother John were not getting the same love as the other white grandchildren were. Like, they weren't getting the same elaborate Christmas presents and things like that. You know, Matt's grandfather ended up dying a few years later, but they did have a better relationship after that conversation. But I can't even imagine how difficult that would have been for him as a child to experience that. And Matt obviously talks a lot about growing up biracial in the book and living in a white town in Raleigh. You know, he would even go to his white friends' houses and they would introduce him as, "Whoa, his mom's white," or, you know, kind of things like that. You know, Matt's dad is Nigerian and then his mom is white. So he is biracial, but he definitely looks a little bit more on the blacker side than his white side. I mean, he had to kind of overcome that and fight that, and he did. And one of the ways he did that was playing sports. He loved football. He was a natural. He did not grow up with a lot of money, so he never expected to go to college. But once he started playing football in high school, his coaches told him, they're like, "You could get a scholarship, you can go to college for free." So that's when he started getting scouted, and then he knew that he could make a name for himself and do something better for himself. You know, his brother John ended up going to jail at 17 and was in and out of jail for 7 years. Matt really was like the younger brother that had a lot more going for him at the time. So he ended up going to college and played football there. And I mean, he had a really college experience. He talks a lot about sports, so those were kind of the boring chapters for me where I was not interested and I kind of had to skim through. But sports means so much to him, guys. Like, it literally means the world to him. And he talked a lot about his like athletic journey and other things like that, which I just like could not sit through. Really enjoyed like other parts of the book, but this was just like the part of the book where I was just like, no, I'm not reading this part.
You were the only reason that I decided to do the show.
So Matt ended up graduating college. He moved back to Raleigh, North Carolina with his mom, and he was pretty miserable for a while because he was like, I literally went to college, got my degree. He wanted to play NFL because his two best friends ended up going into the NFL and like reaching, you know, like celeb status, and then Matt kind of like rode their coattails a little bit, visiting his two friends, one in Texas, one was in Baltimore, and Matt just felt so sorry for himself because he was home after college for like a year, finding temp jobs. Eventually, he moved to Pittsburgh and started doing like banking and investment banking, and he lived in Pittsburgh for a year and a half, and he loved it, and he found a stable job. He was paying like $500 a month, and then one weekend he went to New York City and fell in love with New York City, and he wanted to move to New York and take a chance. I think he was around 25 or 26 at the time. He moved to New York. He started a new job as a media planner. He really had to take a risk because his job in Pittsburgh was just so stable, and he was just starting to build a life for himself, but he just wanted to try out New York. So he found roommates on Craigslist. He was moving roommates every month or two, and like he has some really funny roommate stories about like these cats and like these rules his roommates would have. Like he lived with the weirdest people ever. Thank God he ended up living with Tyler Cameron in his mid-20s. What an upgrade, because some of his roommates were literally insane. Don't find roommates through Craigslist, people. This is why I live alone. And we really work our way to The Bachelor. Now, I started telling you guys the story about how he got on The Bachelorette in the beginning of this video, but now we gotta talk about how he became The Bachelor. So he was living with the quarantine crew at the time. He was about to prepare for his season of The Bachelorette. And the quarantine crew got pretty big on TikTok at the time, so they started making cameos to give back to charity. And that's when Claire Crawley, the Bachelorette, who was just waiting around for her season, got wind of it, thought that Matt was being a clout chaser, which was the complete opposite. Matt never wanted to go on this show. He just kind of got thrown into it because of his buddy Tyler and of course Tyler's mom. Matt was just like a little taken back, and then he kind of got his first taste of the media world. But it was the height of BLM, and you know, The Bachelor was getting a lot of backlash about not having a black lead. So they called Matt James up and they said, why don't you just become The Bachelor? He was very hesitant at first because he didn't really know what it meant. He was kind of confused because he never even made it to the Bachelorette season. They also announced that he was going to be the Bachelor before Claire's season like even started. So it was totally out of left field. He ended up deciding to go through with it. As I mentioned, he was iffy because, you know, he knew after a few days that this was going to be the first black lead, so he knew the weight that that held on him. Is he going to choose a black girl? Is he going to choose a white girl? Like, he felt that pressure, but he ultimately decided to go through with it, and he went to Nima Colin, and he talks a little bit about his experience in the last couple of chapters, you know, being the lead, meeting the incredible women. You know, he was very grateful for a lot of the crew and the staff, especially at the hotel of Nima Colin, but also like the people who put in time and energy behind the scenes to make The Bachelor what it is. It's not all toxic, but he definitely felt like there was a lot of unnecessary drama throughout his season. He does talk about his time with Rachel, so let's get into it.
I really want them to call you in, and I want you to do this work.
So Matt pretty much knew from the beginning that he was going to pick Rachel. They had a spark from the beginning, and he just really felt something with her. Matt did say that they didn't really talk about race throughout his season of The Bachelor. He said he saved those conversations for the black women on the show, and with the white women on the show, he didn't talk too much about race. So they really never had those conversations, but one point in the journey towards the end, Rachel asked him if they were going to receive a lot of backlash for being an interracial couple. So they talked a little bit about it, but they ultimately decided to leave the show together hand in hand. They never got engaged. They're still not engaged today, but Matt ended up choosing Rachel. They were really, really happy after the show. Matt decided that he wasn't going to look at social media while his season was airing. So it actually took weeks for him to hear about these rumors about Rachel's past. Now, Rachel did kind of mention to him, you know, some of these things were starting to come up. She had this huge microscope under her now that she's on The Bachelor. Matt had a huge microscope under him. Matt told Rachel to ignore those things, and he just kind of brushed things under the rug until it came on like a big news network on TV, and Matt had an anchorman explain to him Rachel was seen at an antebellum party. Rachel, you know, was at this party that perpetuated racism, and Matt did not know all of this information, and he obviously called her and she was crying and she was shaking. In that moment, you know, Matt realized that they didn't have the important conversations they needed to have about race during his time on The Bachelor, and there was so much going on now in the public eye that Matt and Rachel both needed time to be apart and process things. Matt had to process how he felt, and Rachel kind of had to do the work, and Matt knew that she had to educate herself and do the work. So they took time apart and they didn't talk for a couple of weeks. However, it was a week before after the final rose, she reached out to him and broke the silence. You know, Rachel put out her apology and her explanation to her Instagram at the time, and they started texting every day, and then they went to after the final rose and they kind of had to explain where they were at and how the last few months of their life were. Matt did say that they felt like they were explaining it more for the viewers because obviously they had their own relationship behind the scenes that they weren't necessarily sharing, but they ultimately, you know, ended up leaving after the final rose hand in hand. They talked backstage in the green room and they realized that the spark was still there. They couldn't be together at that moment because Rachel still needed to do the work and they still had to process everything that happened with the media and the controversy. They still took time apart after that, but they were still talking and mending their relationship in some ways. Matt actually decided to talk to a few other girls, a few other flings. Matt wanted to kind of revisit those other relationships before committing to Rachel, and Rachel got wind of that and gave him an ultimatum. Rachel said, "I'm not going to be one of these girls you're talking to. You're either going to be all in with me or you're not going to be in with me at all." And she cut him off.
The butterflies have not stopped since night one.
Quite literally cut him off. She was the one that broke up with him. And then randomly, Matt was in Georgia at like a Triller fight for like the boxing match for the influencers, and Rachel started sharing her location with Matt. Now Rachel lives in Georgia. Matt looked at the phone and realized that Rachel was 2 blocks away, so Matt thought that Rachel wanted him to come meet her, and Matt was obviously excited because she was the one that cut it off. However, Rachel didn't mean to send her location to Matt. Rachel just decided to unblock Matt's number, and then the location on the iPhone automatically just started sharing again with Matt. So he went to go meet Rachel. They talked for 4 hours in the car about everything that just happened between them, The Bachelor, just like all of the stuff that was, you know, weighing heavy on them the past few months. And they decided in that moment for 4 hours after that conversation that they wanted to get back together and work on their relationship. And that's kind of where Matt's journey and his book ends. He doesn't really talk too much more about their relationship. He didn't give too many behind the scenes, you know, secrets of The Bachelor, anything like that. The majority of the book truly is about his childhood, adolescence, growing up, his family, football, and all of that kind of stuff. It is a short read. I read it in a couple days. It was 225 pages. I think Matt did a good job because the first chapter was kind of like leaning into The Bachelor, because I know a lot of people are buying this book because we're Bachelor fans, and then like so much of the book is not about The Bachelor before it becomes about it again at the end. I really liked the book overall. Like I said in the beginning, I really enjoyed the beginning and I really enjoyed the end. The middle was very boring for me. I will say that I expected a little bit more. He didn't really mention anybody else from his season. He didn't talk too much about his friendship with Tyler. I would have liked a little bit more, but that's not who Matt is. Matt's a straight guy. He's not really, you know, writing a book about gossip and juice. Like Hannah Brown's book was all about hookups and the drama and the Bachelorette and her pageantry. You know, that is a book that is more catered to me. However, overall, I really enjoyed the read, and I definitely recommend you guys check it out if you have the time. I mean, I did tell you everything you need to know, so you don't have to read it if you don't want to. But I really enjoyed the book, and I'm gonna give it an 8 out of 10. I think that anyone who writes a book should be very proud. So I'm really happy to have read the book. Thank you for sharing your story with all of us, and me, Matt James, if you come across this YouTube video. If you guys have any more questions or comments about the book, feel free to leave them in the comments down below. I will respond to them. I will do TikToks about them. But this was pretty much my overall general recap and review of the book. And I mean, it was good, and I can't wait to read more Bachelor books in the future. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel before you guys go, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Bye!